we need to understand about our enemy and about our own weaknesses is that when the Bible speaks, and all through the Bible it talks about having an enemy, it talks about Satan, he knows you very well. He has observed you, he knows your tendencies, he knows your weaknesses, and not only that, he's seen a million just like you. They've come and gone through the years. He's an expert in luring. His tackle box is diverse. It has every lure, and and some of us, we've had those victories in the past. We've overcome a temptation, and Satan has drawn this temptation out, and we've overcome it. Does Satan just quit and run away and never come back? It comes back a little stronger, doesn't it? Isn't that just the way it works? And the lure becomes a bit stronger. It's always fascinated me. I'm not a fisherman per se. I've actually only gone a few times. Wouldn't say I'm good at it or anything. But I'm always fascinated by these big fish when they're caught, okay? Think of like a big bass who's caught, and he's a big old fish. He's been around a while, and he has seen a lot of lures, likely. Okay, especially if you go to somewhere that's a familiar fishing spot. And I think that must be why it's just so awesome to get that prized catch. Because this fish, he has escaped temptation in the past. And you have to be a really good fisherman. You have to have just the right lure to get him. And here's Satan as the expert fisher for temptation and the expert drawing and luring us into that. When he catches the big fish, boy, that's a big prize. And all of us are susceptible not just to those outside, almost uncontrollable urges, but those little steps that get us a little bit closer and a little bit closer. And you know what the purpose of bait is? The purpose of bait really is just to hide the consequences. To hide the consequences. And that's when we move to the next letter B, disobedience, when we actually take that bait, when we're actually caught in the trap. Not just deception, that's where it begins. It starts with this mental, emotional level. We begin to think about satisfying and fulfilling those prohibited desires. Then it moves to disobedience. Disobedience is the act of the will. So if you're writing in the blank, or if you want to keep that flow of thought going, we've gone to something emotional and natural that's moved into our mind. That is, our mind has now begun to develop and plan and scheme ways in which to fulfill that which is not good or that which is destructive. And now we actually act on it. And there's where the sin is committed. Disobedience, we rebel against God's boundaries. There's the phrase there, conceived and gives birth to sin. Now, the difference between maturity and immaturity, I think a good definition, is that those who are immature do what feels good. Those who are mature do what they know they need to do. They act and they're responded to. They control their will and their desire and their impulses. Okay? Adults make plans. They set out projections. They know what is right and responsible, and they fulfill it. It is the immature, it's the child that does what he feels like whenever he wants, and they need to be controlled, and they need to have boundaries, and they need to be protected, because if you let them go, they will just do whatever they think, whatever they feel good. And what happens is when we see ourselves constantly falling into this pattern of our desires, move into this area of deception, we're easily deceived, and we find ourselves disobeying much more than we obeyed, we're looking at a maturity problem. We no longer have the capacity to function and control our own will. We are now driven and controlled and become slaves to our own desires. Taken over us. That's why the immature fall so quickly. And it moves one step worse because there's always the conclusion. There's always the bad ending here. And so letter C, we come to death. Death. And we read there, where sin is fully conceived, it gives birth to death. We all experience the consequences. Romans 6:23 we read, for the wages of sin, or the price or the payment of sin, is death. Now, whether or not you actually believe the Bible is true or completely understand how all that works, that I think most everyone in here can see, at least from a practical standpoint, how that works. You know, when you sin, something dies. You've thought about that? How many of you know marriages that have died because of the sin of one or both spouses? How many of you have seen friendships die because of the way friends mistreat or betray or slander the other friend? How many of you see parent and children relationships die because of the dysfunction that's just festered and grown, the sinfulness there? How many of you seen or had your own innocence die because of the decision that you followed through, a disobedient act of the will in which you engaged? See, we can all understand on a very practical purpose, immediately when we sin, something dies. Now, the Bible tells us something that we probably wouldn't know otherwise. We might not have connected the dots unless the Bible had made it clear. Because when God told Adam and Eve, and then it was repeated again by the Apostle Paul, clarified for us, that the day you eat of the fruit, God said to Adam and Eve, the day you disobey, you will surely die. There's a death sentence that has now been pronounced on your head. God demands the payment of one's life for the behavior of sin. Now, that's even deeper than you might even expect, because when you hear that at first thought, you think, well, everybody sins, okay, and everybody dies. Sounds like a very easy correlation. But when we read about it in the Bible, it's much darker than that. The news is much worse, because not only do we die physically, which is true, there is a spiritual death, which is separation from God. There's eternal punishment that is associated with the idea and the concept of spiritual death. When you come to the book of Revelation, and it describes that judgment day when every soul alive who has not received Jesus Christ has to face God at that judgment, at that white throne judgment it's called, that those who had not had their sins taken care of, and we'll get to that in a moment, those who have not had their sins forgiven will be cast into the lake of fire, the Bible says, and this is the second death. That's the way it's described. And so the punishment, even though we can understand it on a basic level, it's much deeper and much more profound and much more horrific than we can imagine. Now here's the irony of it, and this is a dark irony, and I don't want you to miss it. I don't want to sound cruel. I certainly don't want to sound flippant, but I think you need to understand what James is exactly saying here. The graphic terms with which James is using. Now some of you in here, and I have grieved with you, have dealt with the grief of a miscarriage. Some of you dealt with late term, maybe even stillborn births. Has to be one of the most horrific things a person can endure. Most of you know I'm one of 9 children. My parents I'm the third of 9. I have 2 older sisters, 2 younger sisters, and 4 younger brothers. However, most of you don't know that 1 year before I was born, my mother had a stillborn, a little girl. My mother actually had 10 births. And I always say I have a sister in heaven I've never met. And I don't know, she's probably 7 or 8 months old at that time when she was delivered. 7, 8 months pregnant. And you know what? My parents rarely, if ever, talk about it. We've probed them a couple times over the year, just kids being curious. What were you going to name her? You know, just kind of, because most of us weren't there, and my older sisters were just little babies. But it's a dark time. A dark episode. Very depressing, very agonizing. Now again, James is using a very graphic term, and I don't want you to miss it because it speaks to the severity of this. You see, those months, and those of you who have experienced can relate to that, those months of anticipation that something good and enjoyable is going to come out of this, and then the horror of finding out that it is death in the womb. And when we engage in that sin and we go from that desire to my cognitive thoughts, and I want to act on it, and then I actually do, and I engage in sin, and I think by doing this I will be gratified, I will be fulfilled, my intimacy will be experienced, or I will have that which I feel that I deserve, or I will lash out in anger or rage or fear as an attempt to control my environment, and we think it's going to bring a better quality of life. No one really goes into it with the self-destructive focus. And James says, like the graphic of having a stillborn child, the end result of that is going to be horror. Because sin always leads in death and destruction. We can choose, we can make our choices and temptations, but we don't choose the consequences. If anything, we see over and over again the warnings that are laid out. And it is very dark and very deep, the consequences. And there's a stern warning. These are hard words, I know that. But they're words for us to consider. Now when we come to the last part, when we get to the solution, and how we can actually learn to resolve, how do we battle? Because so many of you recognize, you know that sequence. You know what it's like to have a natural desire to control your environment, and then you start thinking of thoughts of worry and fear and obsession, and then you start to act out in paranoia. You start to distance relationships. You start to put all these restrictions around your family and your spouse, and you just start acting out in these overprotective, worried ways. And then the next thing you know, your children are broken away. You have dysfunctional adult relationships, and you can just see the progress of sin. You see it in all kinds of sequences in your life. It's gone from desire to deception to disobedience to ultimate